At 62, Martha Keene had no house, no job, and barely enough money left to keep gas in the old Ford Taurus she had been sleeping in for weeks. Every morning, she washed her face in a gas station restroom and told her grown son she was staying comfortably with a friend. Because admitting that his mother was homeless felt harder than spending another freezing night curled behind a steering wheel. Then, at a county liquidation auction in the small farming town of Red Willow, Kansas, Martha did something even she couldn't fully explain. She spent $100, nearly the last cash she had, on an abandoned 12-stall horse barn with broken windows, a sagging roof, and no house anywhere on the property. People at the auction laughed. One farmer warned her that repairing the barn would cost more than the land was worth. But Martha wasn't trying to become a farmer. For $100, she had bought the one thing she desperately needed: a piece of ground where nobody could tell her to leave. That first evening, she walked through the ruined barn, imagining where she might put a mattress and how she could survive the coming cold. She counted 11 empty stalls with rotting doors and rusted hinges. Then she reached the far end and stopped. Stall 12 was different. Its oak door was solid. A steel chain had been wrapped tightly around it, secured with a padlock that looked much newer than anything else in the abandoned barn. Martha assumed the county had forgotten to remove it until she looked down and saw fresh hoofprints in the dirt. Beside them lay clean hay that couldn't have been there for more than a day. Then something heavy shifted behind the locked door, and Martha heard the unmistakable slow breath of an animal in the darkness. Someone had been coming onto her property. Someone had been feeding whatever was hidden inside stall 12. And when Martha finally learned why that stall had been kept locked, she discovered that the ruined barn she'd bought for her last $100 had been hiding a promise that stretched back decades. But before we find out what's behind that door, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Whether you're starting your morning, taking a quiet afternoon break, or listening late at night, I hope you have a peaceful and beautiful day ahead. And if you enjoy emotional stories about ordinary people, forgotten places, and secrets waiting to be uncovered, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to that abandoned barn in Red Willow, because Martha is standing outside stall 12, and something on the other side has just moved again. Martha Keene woke before sunrise with her cheek pressed against the cold window of her Ford Taurus. Her neck ached from sleeping upright, and a thin layer of condensation covered the windshield. Behind her, the 24-hour laundromat glowed beneath fluorescent lights. She had learned that parking there was safer than empty lots because cars came and went all night. Still, she never stayed 2 nights in the same place. At 62, Martha had become skilled at making homelessness look temporary. She folded her blanket into the trunk, drove to a gas station, and washed in the restroom before anyone could ask questions. Her phone rang as she returned to the car. Daniel. "Morning, Mom. You're up early. So are you." That looked at the duffel bag containing nearly everything she owned. "My friend gets up early." The lie came easily now. Daniel believed she was staying with someone after losing her rental when the diner where she'd worked closed. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine." "You'd tell me if you weren't." Martha forced a smile he couldn't see. "Of course." After hanging up, she counted the cash in her wallet. $138. That afternoon, she attended a county liquidation auction because the notice mentioned used furniture. She hoped to find something she could resell. Instead, near the end, the auctioneer announced a neglected parcel outside Red Willow. A photograph showed weeds surrounding a long, weather-beaten horse barn. No residents. The auctioneer warned, "Structure sold as is. Nobody bid." He lowered the opening price twice. $100. Anybody? Someone behind Martha laughed. County ought to pay us $100 to take it. A few people chuckled. Martha stared at the photograph. No house, broken windows, sagging roof. But it was land. Land with a structure. Land where an owner could park without someone tapping on the glass at 2 in the morning, before she could reconsider. Martha raised her hand. The room went quiet. Then someone laughed again. 100, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 150? Nobody answered. Sold! Martha's stomach dropped. She had just spent nearly everything she had on a ruined horse barn. Outside, a gray-haired man in a work jacket approached her. You're the woman who bought the Wade place. Apparently, Eli Mercer. He nodded toward her paperwork. You know that barn needs more repairs than the property's probably worth. I gathered that from the applause. The corner of his mouth moved. Just making sure. Martha folded the papers. For $100. I wasn't expecting a resort. Eli studied her for a moment, but didn't ask why she'd bought it. Martha appreciated him for that. By late afternoon, she reached the property. The barn stood beyond a rusted gate, surrounded by waist-high weeds. Up close, it looked worse than the auction photograph. Boards had warped away from the siding. Several windows were broken. Inside, dust covered the central aisle, and sunlight slipped through gaps in the roof. Yet when Martha placed the deed paperwork on an old workbench, something tightened in her throat. For months, everything had belonged to someone else: parking spaces, bathrooms, borrowed corners. This ruin was hers. She could legally remain here. Martha walked deeper into the barn. An old property map from the auction packet listed 12 stalls. She counted as she passed them. 1 through 11 stood open, their doors crooked or missing, interiors empty except for straw and debris. At the far end, she stopped. Stall 12 was closed, unlike the others. Its heavy wooden door remained solid. A steel chain had been wrapped through the latch. An old padlock held it shut. Martha stepped closer, suddenly aware of how quiet the barn had become. She tugged the chain once. It did not move. 11 abandoned stalls stood open behind her. The 12th had been deliberately locked. Martha spent her first night in the tack room because it had a door that still closed and only one cracked window. She swept out mouse droppings, carried in her blanket and duffel bag, and arranged 2 old saddle pads beneath her sleeping bag to soften the concrete floor. It was hardly a bedroom, but when she locked the barn's outer door, she experienced something she had not felt in weeks. Nobody could tell her to move along. The temperature dropped after midnight. Wind slipped through gaps in the siding. And somewhere above her, a loose sheet of metal knocked against the roof. Martha slept in her coat. Shortly after sunrise, a truck rolled through the gate. Eli climbed out carrying a battery lantern. Thought you might discover the electricity isn't dependable. I discovered that before dark. He handed her the lantern. Don't trust the wiring. Some of it's older than you are. That's becoming less impressive every year. Eli smiled and followed her inside. He showed her where the water shutoff was and pointed out a section of roof that would leak badly in heavy rain. When they reached the end of the aisle, his eyes settled on stall 12. Martha noticed. Know what's in there? Haven't been inside in years. That's not what I asked. Eli rubbed his jaw. The Wade place has history. Does the history own a key, not me? He changed the subject by warning her about a rotten support near the storage room. Martha let him. She had known Eli less than a day, and he had already given her more useful help than she had asked for. After he left, she examined stall 12 more carefully. The chain was weathered with rust, but the padlock wasn't. Its metal surface had scratches, yet none of the deep corrosion covering the hinges around it. Someone had replaced it relatively recently. Martha crouched. In the dirt beneath the door were hoof prints. Fresh ones. She followed them several yards down the aisle before they disappeared among older marks and debris. Near the wall, she found a handful of clean hay, not the gray, brittle straw scattered through the other stalls. This was yellow-green and still smelled sweet. Wonderful. Martha muttered, "Trespassers." Behind the barn, she found a water bucket tucked beside the wall. The water was clear, with no leaves or insects floating on top. Someone had filled it recently. Martha's irritation competed with unease. The county had sold the property as abandoned, yet somebody had been using it, and Eli had clearly known more than he wanted to say. She spent the afternoon securing broken windows with boards she found in the storage area, with only $38 left. Buying materials was not an option. Everything had to be reused. Near sunset, while dragging a sheet of plywood across the aisle, Martha heard something outside. A gate hinge squeaked. She set down the plywood and stepped through the rear door. A slim girl in a hooded sweatshirt stood near the fence carrying an empty feed sack. The girl froze when she saw Martha. "Hey," Martha called. "This is private property." The girl turned and ran. "Wait," Martha followed, but at 62 she had no chance of catching a teenager. The girl slipped through a gap in the rear fence and disappeared along a tree line. Martha stopped, breathing hard. She could have called after her again, but something about the girl's expression stayed with her. It had not been the careless look of someone caught trespassing for fun. Martha knew that look. It was the look of someone whose first instinct was to disappear before anyone could ask questions. She returned to the fence and found a narrow path pressed through the weeds. It led back toward the barn. Following it, Martha reached the rear wall directly behind stall 12. Fresh hoofprints marked the softer earth there, too. She went inside and stood before the chained door. "All right," she whispered. "What are they hiding?" Something struck the wood from the other side. Martha jumped backward. Silence returned. Then came a slow scrape across the floor, followed by the unmistakable shifting weight of a large animal. Martha stepped closer despite herself. From the darkness behind the locked door came a deep, warm exhale. She knew that sound. A horse was breathing on the other side. Martha was waiting near the rear fence when the girl returned the next afternoon. This time she carried a small bale of hay and stopped the instant she saw Martha. "Don't run," Martha said. The girl tightened her grip on the bale. "I'm not calling anyone. I just want to know why there's a horse locked inside my barn." "She's not yours. The barn is. You can't open that stall." That's folded her arms. That's an interesting thing to tell the person holding the deed. The girl's fear sharpened into anger. "Please, just leave it alone. What's your name?" After a long hesitation, she answered, "Nora. I'm Martha." "Now, Nora, either you explain what you're doing here, or I start making calls." Nora's face drained of color. "Don't call animal control, then talk to me." Before she could answer, an older sedan came bouncing down the dirt track. A gray-haired woman climbed out and walked toward them with surprising speed. "Nora Bell. I told you not to come alone." She looked at Martha. "I'm Ruth Bell, her grandmother." "Good. Maybe you can explain stall 12. Ruth glanced toward the barn. "How much do you know?" "Enough to know somebody has been feeding a horse on property the county sold to me." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. "Her name is Willow, inside the barn." Ruth explained that Willow had belonged to Nora's mother years earlier, when illness made it impossible for her to keep paying for boarding. Samuel Wade had promised the mare would always have a place there. After Nora's mother died, Samuel kept that promise. Then Samuel died. Ruth said the barn closed The estate became a mess, and eventually the county took the property. So you've been trespassing? Nora stepped forward. I have. Grandma told me to stop. And you didn't. Where was Willow supposed to go? The question landed harder than Nora could have known. Martha thought of laundromat parking lots, gas station bathrooms, and the constant calculation of where she could remain without being noticed. She looked away. How do you get inside? Ruth removed a key from her coat pocket. Martha almost laughed. Of course. Ruth unlocked the padlock and unwound the chain. When the door opened, a chestnut mare lifted her head from the far corner. Willow was old. Her back slightly dipped with age, but her coat was brushed and her stall was clean. Nora immediately went to her, resting her forehead against the mare's face. Martha's anger weakened. She looks healthy. I take care of her, Nora said. Hay isn't free. I know. Neither is this property anymore. Nora looked down. Ruth touched her granddaughter's shoulder. We'll find somewhere. That knew what somewhere meant when people had no money. It often meant nowhere. She stepped into the stall and noticed how different it was from the others. The oak boards were thicker. The hinges had been reinforced. Even the interior latch appeared built to last. Why this one? She asked. Ruth didn't answer. Martha ran her hand along one of the support beams and felt shallow grooves beneath her fingertips. She brushed away dust. Names had been carved into the wood. Some were accompanied by dates. 1989, 1994, 2001, 2008. There were dozens, extending farther up the beam than she could easily read. These are previous horses? Martha asked. Ruth's expression became guarded. Samuel kept records his own way. Nora watched Martha nervously. Are you making Willow leave? Martha looked at the mare, then at the teenager, trying not to appear frightened. $38 remained in Martha's wallet. She could barely feed herself, much less an elderly horse. Keeping Willow made no practical sense. Temporarily, Martha said. Nora blinked. What? She can stay temporarily. You keep providing her hay and doing the work. We figure out the rest later. Relief crossed Nora's face so quickly that Martha had to look away. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. And no more sneaking onto my property. If you're coming, you come through the gate. Nora nodded. Ruth remained beside the carved beam. Martha noticed her staring at one particular name. What aren't you telling me? Ruth traced the wood with one finger. You asked if these belonged to horses. Yes. Ruth turned toward her. They don't. Martha glanced again at the dozens of names and dates carved into stall 12. Then whose names are they? Ruth's face tightened with old memory. People, she said. Those aren't the names of horses. Ruth kept her hand against the carved beam. Samuel never rented stall 12. Martha looked at Willow, then back at the names. You just told me he kept Nora's mother's horse here. That's different. Ruth explained that whenever someone around Red Willow fell into trouble and could no longer afford boarding, Samuel gave their horse stall 12. Sometimes for a week, sometimes for months. People lose jobs. Farms fail. Someone gets sick. A marriage falls apart. Selling an animal you've had 15 years can feel like losing the last piece of your old life. And Samuel did this for free. Usually. Martha studied the carvings. Why the secrecy? Ruth gave her a tired smile. Because pride doesn't disappear just because you're broke. Mart looked away before Ruth could notice how precisely the words landed. Over the next several days, she began asking about the names Eli recognized more than she expected. He pointed to one carved near shoulder height. Calvin Dorsey. His farm nearly went under in the 90s. Calvin still lived outside town. When he heard Martha had bought the Wade barn, he came by in an old pickup. Standing inside stall 12, he admitted Samuel had kept his daughter's mare for 4 months while the bank threatened foreclosure. "My girl was 12, Calvin said. "She thought losing that horse meant we were losing everything." "Did Samuel ever ask you to repay him?" Martha asked. "Not once." Another name belonged to a widow who had undergone months of treatment and could not manage her gelding. Another family had lost work after a grain elevator closed. Each story was ordinary enough to have happened anywhere, yet each had left a mark on the same wooden beam. Between conversations, Martha worked on the barn. Nora arrived every afternoon through the front gate now, always carrying something for Willow. In exchange for keeping the mare there, she swept stalls, cleared debris, and helped patch gaps in the siding. Martha found that she liked the girl's quiet competence. Eli appeared one morning with salvaged boards stacked in his truck for the roof supports, he said. "I didn't ask for lumber." "No, I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." That shoulders stiffened. "Then take it back." Eli stared at her. "It's scrap from my equipment shed. It's yours, and I'm giving it to you. I don't take charity." Nora, sweeping nearby, suddenly became very interested in the floor. Eli rested both hands on the truck bed. "Fine. Come repair my north fence after we're done here." Martha hesitated. "How much fence?" "Enough to make you regret being stubborn." That almost made her smile. "Deal." Accepting the lumber became easier once it had a price she could pay with work. Together they replaced several rotten boards and stabilized part of the roof. The improvements were small, but the barn began to feel less like a place waiting to collapse. Other problems remained. Rain still found its way through 2 sections of roofing, and when Martha tested an old light near the storage room, it flickered violently before going dark. Eli immediately told her not to trust any wiring she had not inspected. "Eventually, you're going to need an electrician. Eventually, I'm going to need money." That too. One evening, while Nora groomed Willow, Martha searched the old office beside the tack room. If Samuel had helped dozens of families, she reasoned, he must have recorded something. Most cabinets were empty. She found feed receipts, rusted tools, and water-stained veterinary forms, but no useful accounts. Then she noticed one wallboard behind a low shelf sat slightly forward from the others. Martha moved the shelf and pried at the board with a screwdriver. It loosened enough for a thin object to slide free and fall into the dust. An old ledger. Its cover was cracked and darkened with age. Nora came to the doorway. "What's that?" "Hopefully, answers." Martha opened it carefully. The first several pages had been torn out. Farther in, handwritten names appeared beside dates and brief notes. Martha recognized Calvin Dorsey. She recognized the widow Ruth had mentioned. More names followed, many matching the carvings in stall 12. But the columns where ordinary business books would show amounts owed contained strange, handwritten marks instead. Martha turned back toward the missing front pages. Whatever Samuel had been recording, somebody had removed the beginning of it. Martha carried the ledger to the tack room, where the battery lantern gave enough light for her Nora and Eli to examine the pages without trusting the barn's wiring. Samuel's handwriting was cramped but consistent. Each entry listed a family name, a horse, a date, and sometimes a few words explaining the circumstances. Surgery, layoff, drought year, house fire. Beneath many entries where Martha expected to find a balance. Samuel had written the same phrase, "paid forward." "That doesn't tell us who paid him," Martha said. Eli turned another page. "Maybe nobody did." Ruth arrived before dusk, and when Martha showed her the ledger, she seemed less surprised than sad. "Samuel had a rule," Ruth said. If he gave someone stall 12, they weren't allowed to repay him. Nobody refuses repayment forever. Samuel did. Why? Because he knew people hated feeling indebted when they were already struggling. He told them that if things got better, they could help somebody else. Nora traced one of the entries without touching the paper. Paid forward. Ruth nodded. Exactly. Martha closed the ledger harder than necessary. That's a nice idea until hay needs buying and roofs need repairing. Samuel knew that too. Ruth said he wasn't foolish. The other stalls paid bills when business was good. Stall 12 was different. Martha carried the ledger back toward the office. She understood Samuel's rule more than she wanted to. A debt could be measured. Kindness could not. That made kindness harder to accept. The next morning, she and Nora cleared another stall. Martha repaired a loose hinge while Nora hauled out rotten straw. They had fallen into an easy rhythm until Nora asked, "Where's your house?" Martha's hammer stopped. "What?" "Your house. You always leave your car here, and your stuff is in the tack room." "I'm fixing the place. That wasn't what I asked." That looked at the 16-year-old and almost laughed at being cornered so efficiently. "I live here." Nora glanced toward the tack room. "In there. For now." "You bought a horse barn because you didn't have anywhere else?" Martha's face warmed. "I bought property because it was cheap." Nora said nothing. That was worse than pity. "Don't look at me like that. I'm not good." Nora picked up the pitchfork. "I was just thinking Willow wasn't the only one who needed somewhere nobody could make her leave." Martha turned back to the hinge. "Finish that stall." Nora obeyed. But the words stayed over the following days. Martha began imagining uses for the empty spaces. She had no money for a grand reopening, and most stalls needed repairs, but 2 could be made serviceable with salvaged boards and labor. Perhaps someday she could offer inexpensive temporary boarding, not charity, she told herself, something practical, something that paid enough to keep the roof standing. Then a county inspector stopped by after noticing activity on the property. He was polite but direct. If Martha intended to operate the barn commercially, damaged roofing, electrical hazards, fencing, and several structural issues would need attention. The list was longer than her remaining money could survive. After he left, she sat on an overturned bucket with the inspection sheet in her lap. Eli read it over her shoulder. "None of that's surprising. It's expensive, which is worse. One piece at a time. Easy to say when you own a functioning farm." Eli did not argue. Martha regretted the remark immediately, but could not bring herself to apologize. She spent the afternoon clearing the storage section instead. Near the back wall, an old outlet was blackened around one edge. Martha crouched. "Eli." He came over, took one look, and frowned. "Don't use that." "I wasn't planning to." The discoloration looked old. But when Martha placed her palm against the wood beside the outlet, she pulled it back. "That's warm." Eli touched it himself. His expression changed. "Go shut off the breaker." Martha stared at the scorched outlet, suddenly aware of the dry boards surrounding it. The wall was warm. Eli shut off the breaker before Martha could argue. The barn fell quiet except for Willow shifting in stall 12 and the wind pushing through gaps in the siding. "We need an electrician," Eli said. "I need money first." "You need both." The electrician came the next morning, examined the scorched outlet, opened several junction boxes, and gave Martha the kind of expression people reserved for bad news. "Most of this wiring needs replacing." "How much?" The estimate made her sit down. It was more than she had paid for the property many times over. "Can I just leave the electricity off in sections?" "Yes, but don't run anything through those old lines. And if you ever want to operate this place properly, It needs to be rewired. After he left, Martha stared at the inspection sheet and wondered whether buying the barn had been foolish after all. She had wanted somewhere no one could make her leave. Instead, she owned a structure she could barely afford to keep standing. "Maybe I should stop," she said. Eli looked up from repairing a gate hinge. "Stop what?" "All of it. The stalls." The idea of boarding horses, pretending this place can become anything. Nora, brushing Willow nearby, froze but said nothing. Eli wiped his hands on his jeans. "Then stop," Martha frowned. "You're not very encouraging. You don't need encouragement. You need to decide what you can actually do." That irritated her because it was true. So they worked without electricity. Martha repaired stall doors by hand. Nora hauled debris. Eli helped reinforce unsafe boards and showed Martha how to brace a weak section without spending money she did not have. At night, Martha used the battery lantern in the tack room and told herself darkness was temporary. Willow began looking stronger. Her coat shone more, and she moved with less stiffness when Nora led her outside. One afternoon, Martha's phone rang. Daniel. She stepped behind the barn before answering. "Hi." "Mom. Everything okay? I was going to ask you that." Martha looked toward the tack room window. "I'm fine. Still staying with your friend?" The lie reached her lips automatically. "Yes." She almost stopped herself, almost said, "Actually, I've been sleeping in a horse barn because I had nowhere else to go." Instead, she added, "She's been very generous." Shame settled heavily after the call ended. Before Martha could return inside, a pickup pulled into the yard. A couple climbed out with a bay gelding and a trailer behind them. The man looked embarrassed. "We heard you might have space. I'm not officially open. We just need somewhere temporary. I hurt my back last month, and work's been thin. We can't keep paying the boarding place outside town." Martha looked toward the barn. "How temporary?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," his wife added quietly. "We can pay something, just not much." Martha thought of Samuel's ledger. Surgery, layoff, drought year, paid forward. She also thought of her own $38. The inspection list and the dead electrical system. Practicality told her to refuse. Then she noticed the man's expression. It was the same one she wore whenever Daniel asked whether she needed help. "Which stall is safest?" she asked Eli later. He pointed to stall 4. "With 2 boards replaced, that one." Martha turned back to the couple. "Pay what you can. You provide feed." The man's shoulders dropped with relief. "Thank you. It's temporary." Understood. That evening, the bay gelding settled into stall 4 while Willow watched from stall 12. Martha stood in the aisle between them and felt something unfamiliar. She was no longer merely hiding inside a ruined barn. Someone had come to her because they needed what this place could provide. The thought frightened her almost as much as it steadied her. Over the next few days, they made the safest parts of the barn usable without power. Martha stopped thinking of every repaired board as proof she could survive alone and started seeing the barn as something that might serve more than one person. Still, the old wiring remained behind the walls, untouched and dangerous. On a windy evening, Martha finished checking stall 4 and turned toward the tack room. A sharp smell stopped her halfway down the aisle. Not hay, not dust. Smoke. Martha smelled smoke before she saw it. She turned toward the storage section and found a thin gray ribbon curling from the wall near the old wiring. "Nora!" she shouted. The girl had arrived minutes earlier to check Willow and came running from stall 12. "What happened? Get outside and call the fire department." A sharp crack sounded inside the wall. Then flame pushed through a gap between 2 dry boards. Wind rushed through the broken siding, feeding it instantly. Nora froze. "Willow, move!" Martha grabbed the halter hanging beside stall 4 while Nora pulled out her phone. The bay gelding was already stamping and tossing his head. Smoke rolled along the ceiling. Martha clipped on the lead rope and dragged the stall door open. "Come on!" The horse resisted once, then followed as heat grew behind them. Nora opened the outer gate, and together they got him into the yard. "Take him farther out," Martha said. "I'm getting Willow." Nora ran back toward the barn. "No, I'm coming. You are not. She won't leave for you." Before Martha could answer, Eli's truck tore through the gate. He jumped out before it fully stopped. I saw the smoke. Flames were now climbing the storage wall. "Get that horse away from the barn," Martha shouted, "and keep Nora outside." Nora tried to push past her. "Willow panics when she's scared." "Then tell me what to do." "Talk to her. Don't pull hard." Martha ran back inside. Smoke burned her eyes almost immediately. At stall 12, Willow was circling, white showing around her eyes. Martha opened the door and reached for the halter. The mare jerked away. "Easy," Martha said, though her own voice shook. Behind her, something crashed. Sparks scattered into the aisle. "Come on, girl. You don't have to understand. Just move." Willow backed into the corner. Martha remembered Nora pressing her forehead to the mare's face. She stopped pulling and stepped closer instead. "You trusted one stubborn girl all this time. Trust another stubborn woman for 30 seconds. Willow's breathing slowed just enough. Martha clipped the rope and turned toward the aisle. This time, the mare followed. They were halfway out when a burning board fell behind them. Willow lunged forward, nearly pulling Martha off her feet, but they reached the yard. Nora grabbed the lead and threw both arms around the mare's neck. "She's out," Eli said. "Now stay out." Martha turned back toward the barn. Through the open door she could see flames spreading toward the office. The old ledger sat on the desk where she had left it earlier that day. Samuel's names. The stall 12 records. "No," Eli said, seeing where she looked. "Absolutely not." "The ledger." "Forget the ledger." Martha knew he was right. Then she thought of the missing pages, the carved names, and every person who had stood inside that stall, telling her what Samuel had done. Before Eli could stop her, she ran back in. The heat struck harder this time. Smoke filled the central aisle in waves. Martha covered her mouth with her sleeve and reached the office. The ledger lay beneath a layer of ash. She grabbed it and turned. A beam cracked overhead. Something slammed against her shoulder and drove her to one knee. Pain shot down her arm. Martha Eli's voice came through the smoke. She tried to stand and nearly fell. Then he was beside her, one arm around her waist. "You are the most unreasonable person I've ever met." Later, gladly, he pulled her toward the exit, while Martha clutched the ledger against her chest. They stumbled into the yard as the first fire engine appeared on the road. Firefighters took over, forcing everyone farther back. Martha sat on the ground while a paramedic examined her shoulder. Nora stayed beside Willow, crying silently. For the next hour, they watched water arc against orange flame. The roof over the storage section collapsed. Several stalls burned through. Stall 12 was blackened and damaged, one side partially gone. By dawn, the fire was out. Everyone was alive. Both horses were safe. The barn was not. Martha stood wrapped in a blanket, staring at the smoking remains of the first place she had called hers in months. The fire chief approached. Soot streaked across his face. "We're lucky nobody was killed." Martha nodded. "Can it be repaired?" He looked toward the collapsed roof and charred framing. "Some of it may be, but rebuilding this properly is going to cost far more than this property is worth." Martha lowered her eyes to the smoke-damaged ledger in her hands and felt, for the second time in one lifetime, homeless. That night, Martha slept in the Ford Taurus again. Eli had offered his spare room, and Ruth had offered her couch. But Martha refused both. She parked beside the blackened barn, lowered the seat, and pulled her blanket over her coat. The position was exactly the same as it had been before the auction, yet everything felt different. Back then, the car had been a place she was trying to escape. Now it sat beside the smoking remains of somewhere she had begun to belong. Her injured shoulder throbbed whenever she moved. Through the windshield, she could see the outline of the collapsed roof against the night sky. At sunrise, the fire chief returned with the preliminary findings. The fire had started in the storage section. Old electrical wiring inside the wall had failed, and the wind had helped spread the flames through dry timber. There was no suggestion of anything deliberate. Martha almost wished there was someone to blame. Instead, the cause was exactly what everyone had warned her about from the beginning: an old barn with dangerous wiring and an owner who could not afford to replace it. The insurance conversation was worse. Her minimal coverage and the barn's documented pre-existing condition meant there would be little money available for rebuilding. Not enough for a new roof, not enough for rewiring, certainly not enough to restore 12 stalls. Martha called a realtor before she could change her mind. "I want to sell the land," she said, afterward. Nora found her sitting on the hood of the Taurus. Willow and the bay gelding had been moved temporarily to Eli's property. "You're selling?" Nora asked. "I can't rebuild this. What about Willow?" "We'll find somewhere safe for her. Stall 12 was safe." Martha looked toward its burned remains. "Not anymore." Nora's eyes filled. But she nodded and walked away before Martha could see her cry. The phone rang that afternoon. Daniel. Martha nearly let it go unanswered. Instead, she picked up. "Mom, you sound tired. There was a fire." Silence. "What fire?" Martha closed her eyes. There was no clean way through the lie anymore. She told him about the auction, the barn, the tack room, the $38 she had left afterward, and the nights she had spent in the car before that. When she finished, Daniel did not speak for several seconds. "You were homeless. I was managing. You were sleeping in your car. I didn't want you worrying, so you lied to me." The hurt in his voice was worse than anger. "You have your own bills, your own life. I'm your son, and I didn't want to become your responsibility." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Come to Colorado." That looked at the ruined barn. "Daniel, I mean it. Stay with me until you figure things out." Tears surprised her. "Thank you." "Is that a yes? It's me saying thank you." She promised they would talk again soon. For the first time, she did not pretend everything was fine. That evening, Eli helped her spread the rescued ledger pages across folding tables in an undamaged corner of the barn. Smoke and water had fused several sheets together. Martha separated them carefully, using towels and patience. "You risked your life for this thing," Eli said. "I'd like to know why." "So would I." Near midnight, 2 pages finally peeled apart. They had been stuck together long before the fire. Their edges warped with age. Names filled both sides, older entries Martha had never seen. Families from Red Willow, some dating back decades. She carried the pages into better light. Eli. He came beside her and read the first few names. His expression changed. What Martha asked, Eli pointed to one surname, then another. "I know them, from the stall, from town." He continued down the page. "That family's still north of Red Willow. Those people own the feed store now. That one's the father of a roofer I know." Martha looked at the long list. "They're all still here." "Not every person." Eli touched the smoke-stained page. "But the families?" He looked at her. "They're still here," Martha was supposed to meet the realtor at 9. At 8:15, she heard a truck coming through the gate. Eli's pickup stopped beside the burned barn with a load of lumber strapped across the bed. Martha stepped out of her car. "What's that, Wood?" "I can see that. Then we're making progress." Eli lowered the tailgate. "I'm selling." "You haven't sold yet." "And I'm not rebuilding." Before he could answer, another truck turned onto the property. A man Martha recognized from town climbed out and introduced himself as a retired electrician. Eli said, "You need wiring." Martha stared at him. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask." A third vehicle arrived before she could object, then a fourth. By 9, the realtor's car could barely get through the gate. People were unloading roofing sheets, salvaged lumber, tools, fencing, and bags of feed. A woman from the feed store stacked hay near the fence. 2 farmers began clearing burned debris. Martha stood in the middle of it, bewildered and increasingly angry. "Eli." He was carrying boards toward the barn. "Eli." He stopped. "What did you do?" "Made some calls." "Tell them to take this back?" "No. I cannot repay 20 people." "Nobody asked you to." "That's easy for everyone to say when I'm the one taking." An older man nearby set down his toolbox. "My father took first." Martha turned. He pointed toward the smoke-stained ledger resting on the folding table. "Samuel kept his horse in stall 12 after a crop failure. Dad would have sold her otherwise." The woman from the feed store spoke next. "My grandmother's name is in there. She got sick and couldn't afford boarding for almost 6 months." Another man lifted a sheet of roofing. "Samuel helped my brother." One by one, the names on the damaged pages became people standing in Martha's yard. Some remembered Samuel personally. Others had grown up hearing what he had done for their parents. None spoke as though they were settling an account. That made Martha more uncomfortable, not less. "I appreciate it," she said, forcing the words out, "but I bought this place for $100 because that's what I could afford. I can't turn around and accept thousands in work and materials." Eli walked toward her. "Why not?" "Because I can't pay it back. That was never the deal." "There is always a deal." Eli looked toward the ledger, then read Samuel's. Martha had studied those pages for days. But several lines remained blurred by smoke and water. The retired electrician had brought a magnifying lamp, and beneath its light Martha noticed writing along the bottom of one of the newly separated pages. Samuel's hand was faded but readable. Above it was the familiar phrase, "paid forward." Beneath that, a longer sentence appeared. "People who may someday help someone else." Martha read it twice. "Not people who owe me, not balances due, not favors to collect. Just people who might someday be able to help the next person." "He never expected them to come back here," she said. Ruth, who had arrived with Nora, shook her head. "No, he expected kindness to go somewhere." Martha looked around the property. Nora was carrying water. The feed store owner was unloading hay. A roofer was already measuring what remained of the frame. Eli stood waiting without pressing her. Martha felt the old reflex refuse, manage alone, make herself smaller until nobody had to carry any part of her weight. That reflex had put her in a car while her son believed she was safe. It had made every offered hand feel like a bill waiting to arrive. "I don't know how to accept this," she admitted. Eli's expression softened. "You don't have to know. Just don't send everybody home." Martha looked at the ruined barn, then at the people whose families had once stood where she stood now. Short of money, frightened of losing something they loved, embarrassed to need time. Slowly, she nodded. The work began before she could change her mind. Martha joined them, clearing blackened boards with her good arm. She did not stand aside and become someone's charity project. She worked beside them. By afternoon, the ruined structure looked less like an ending and more like a beginning she could not yet name. Nora came to stand beside her. "So we're rebuilding." "Looks that way." Nora glanced toward the remains of Stall 12. "What are we rebuilding it into?" Martha opened her mouth, then stopped. The answer mattered. She looked at Samuel's ledger, at the people working around her, and at the place she had once bought simply because nobody could make her leave. For the first time, she wondered what it might become for someone else. They did not rebuild the old barn exactly as it had been. Martha insisted on that. 12 stalls had once stretched beneath a roof she could barely afford to patch, and she had no interest in rebuilding something too large to maintain simply because Samuel Wade had owned it that way. Instead, the people of Red Willow helped raise a smaller, safer barn on the sound portion of the foundation. The retired electrician installed new wiring. Roofers replaced the burned structure with materials donated or sold at cost. Eli repaired stall fronts while Nora painted doors, usually leaving streaks on herself as well. Martha worked with her good arm until her shoulder healed enough to carry boards again. She kept a notebook of every hour and every donated item until Ruth caught her totaling it one afternoon. "What are you doing?" "Keeping track." For repayment, Martha hesitated, then closed the notebook. Old habit. 3 weeks into the work, Daniel arrived from Colorado. Martha recognized his truck at the gate and felt the same shame she had felt when admitting the truth over the phone. He stepped out, looked at the Taurus, then at the tack room that had escaped the worst of the fire. "You really lived in there?" "For a while." "And before that, the car?" Martha nodded. Daniel's eyes filled with hurt. "Mom, needing me wouldn't have made you a burden. You have your own life." "So do you. That doesn't mean we stop being family when something goes wrong." That looked down at her hands. "I thought I was protecting you. You were deciding for me." The words stung because they were true. "I'm sorry." Daniel hugged her carefully around the healing shoulder. Martha let him. "Next time," he said. "Give me the chance to be your son. Next time, I'll try." When the barn was finished, a simple sign went up beside the gate. Red Willow Horse Barn. Most stalls would be ordinary paid boarding. The income would cover feed, maintenance, and expenses if Martha managed it carefully. But one stall would never appear on the regular rate sheet. Stall 12. Willow returned on a clear morning with Nora leading her through the new doors. The mare paused at the entrance, sniffed the unfamiliar lumber, then walked inside. Above her stall, Eli and Martha mounted the old carved beam. Fire had blackened one end, but the names and dates remained visible. The rescued ledger stayed in the tack room, protected now inside a cabinet. Martha did not add columns for debts. Months passed. The barn did not make Martha wealthy. Some weeks barely covered expenses, but the paid stalls remained occupied. Nora helped after school, and Martha discovered she was good at the practical rhythm of feeding schedules, repairs, phone calls, and people who loved animals enough to worry about them. A modest, legal living space was built on the property as part of the reconstruction. The first night Martha slept there, she woke at 2 in the morning and listened to the quiet. No laundromat lights, no fear of a knock on the car window, no need to calculate how long she could remain. She was home. One cold afternoon, a farmer arrived pulling a trailer. He moved stiffly when he climbed from his truck and explained that an injury had kept him from working for weeks. "I can feed her," he said, nodding toward the horse behind him. "I just can't cover regular boarding until I'm back on my feet." His embarrassment was familiar enough to make Martha's chest tighten. "How long do you need?" "Maybe a month." "All right." He looked surprised. "What do you charge?" Martha walked into the barn and opened stall 12. Willow had since moved into another stall, leaving the community space available again. The old beam stretched above the door, its carved names catching the afternoon light. "Nothing to me," Martha said. "You cover feed if you can." The man frowned. "I can't just take that." Martha smiled because she knew exactly how those words felt. "Then don't. Help somebody when you can." He looked at her for a long moment before leading his horse inside. That evening, Martha sat outside with 2 cups of coffee. Eli took one and lowered himself into the chair beside her. Their shoulders nearly touched. Neither seemed in a hurry to define what had grown between them. Nora was in the paddock with Willow, talking to the mare as though they were negotiating something important. Beyond them stood the barn, smaller than Samuel's, safer than the one Martha had bought, and more alive than either. "Not bad for $100, Eli said. Martha laughed. The $100 bought a burned-out barn. Technically, it bought the land, too. Always the optimist. She looked toward stall 12. When Martha had raised her hand at the auction, people had laughed at a 62-year-old woman spending almost her last dollar on a place everyone else considered worthless. She had not been brave. She had been homeless and frightened, searching for one piece of ground where nobody could order her away. She had believed security meant owning something outright and needing nobody. Then the barn burned, and everything she had tried to hold alone disappeared in a single night. What came afterward could never have been purchased for $100. It arrived in pickup trucks carrying lumber. It climbed ladders with roofing sheets. It brought hay, wire, tools, labor, and names from an old ledger. Most importantly, it arrived without an invoice. Martha finally understood Samuel's rule. Kindness was not a debt passed from one person to another. It was a door kept open. She had entered through that door when she needed it. Now she could hold it open for someone else. The evening sun settled over Red Willow, turning the new barn walls gold. Martha wrapped both hands around her coffee and listened to Willow moving quietly beyond the fence. For the first time in years, she did not measure her life by what she had lost or what she owed. She had a home, work worth doing, people she no longer had to hide from, and a stall waiting for the next person who needed time. Stall 12 was no longer locked.